In the dead of night, a sealed ruling emerged from behind palace doors, a shocking declaration that left Meghan Markle reeling. The Sussex properties, once symbols of royal independence and global ambition, were quietly signed back to the crown. The implications? Catastrophic. For Meghan, this wasn't just a loss of bricks and mortar, it was a brutal message from the highest authority. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began as a whisper through the cold corridors of the palace, an unscheduled legal consultation that turned into a covert session with the most senior royal advisors. They arrived discreetly, past midnight, summoned not with fanfare, but with urgency. Behind locked doors and under the glow of chandelier light, documents were laid out, language dissected, and a final signature awaited. King Charles III, calm yet cold in expression, added his name to the reversal decree. With a single flourish of his pen, the properties once granted to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were no longer theirs. The act was surgical, efficient, and merciless. Hours later, thousands of miles away, Meghan sat in her Montecito residence, unaware that the world she fought to escape was once again tightening its grip. Her private assistant, pale, shaken, entered the room with the official notification. Meghan read it twice, then again. Her hands trembled. The weight of the Crown's decision was not in the legal jargon, it was in the silence between the lines. It wasn't just a repossession, it was a statement. The Sussex chapter was being erased, and the palace was reclaiming not just land, but control. Across London, the royal inner circle was already spinning. Messages leaked to trusted courtiers, hushed conversations rippled through Windsor and Kensington. "She knows," someone texted. But there was no public response, no prepared rebuttal from the Sussex camp. Their spokesperson had been blindsided, forced into a reactive mode while royal strategists remained one step ahead. No press release, no video statement, only a stunned silence that echoed louder than any denial. What emerged next wasn't panic, it was quiet fury. Meghan's allies watched in disbelief as the story broke across the world without warning, without mercy. There were no hints, no soft transitions, no compromises. The monarchy had made its move with clinical finality. And behind this move, many suspected, was something more than tradition. It was a deeper operation, years in the making, to sever any remaining claim the Sussexes had to the legacy of the crown. But the midnight decree was only the beginning. What followed was a firestorm of emotion, confrontation, and one of the most unexpected royal power plays in years. Frogmore Cottage, a wedding gift, a refuge, a battleground, now stripped away. As Meghan stood in silence before the gates, the echoes of everything she fought for seemed to vanish. What once symbolized modern royalty was being rebranded and reclaimed. There had always been more to Frogmore than met the eye. It was not just a property, it was a sanctuary carved out during the most turbulent moments of Meghan and Harry's royal life. Within those walls they had planned their escape, mourned betrayals, and celebrated the birth of their first child. The nursery, once filled with laughter and lullabies, was now cold, emptied in quiet haste. Every room told a story now being rewritten without their consent. The very place where they hoped to balance tradition with freedom was no longer theirs to protect. What once felt like home now carried the sting of rejection, of a monarchy's decisive erasure of a couple it once embraced. Then came the officials. No fanfare, no warning. Just the discreet arrival of Crown agents sent to oversee the transition. Locks were changed without hesitation, with keycards deactivated before Meghan could even send a protest. It wasn't about logistics, it was symbolism. The quiet message rang loud, "You are no longer part of this." Moments later, royal decorators arrived with swatches and designs, stripping the space of any hint of the Sussex imprint. Paintings removed, furnishings replaced, the echoes of Archie's first steps now drowned in silence. It was no longer a retreat, it was royal property, reclaimed for crown purposes, ready to be rewritten into history without a trace of rebellion. Still reeling, Meghan reportedly made the call. Her voice, calm but weighted, reached the palace through a private channel. She asked no, pleaded for an explanation. But the conversation ended coldly, the tone distant, formal and final. No warmth, no remorse, just a reiterated message that the decision had been sanctioned at the highest level. It was a door firmly shut, both literally and figuratively. Behind the scenes, her advisors scrambled for legal options, but the documents were watertight. The wedding gift had always been conditional, and the conditions had now collapsed under the weight of royal authority. Meanwhile, a new layer to the drama emerged, one that left Meghan stunned. Internal memos revealed that Catherine had been quietly briefed on the estate's reallocation even before the Sussexes received formal notice. The Duchess of Cambridge had reportedly been informed of potential ceremonial or symbolic use for Frogmore in upcoming family events, fueling speculation that her role in this transition was more strategic than passive. For Meghan, this wasn't just a loss of space, it was the erosion of trust. The reallocation was never simply about property, it was about position, legacy, and the gradual unspooling of everything she had once believed could be preserved. As the gates closed on Frogmore, Meghan's team scrambled only to discover that this wasn't an isolated strike, but the unveiling of a larger palace agenda. Whispers became certainty. Meghan, in a private moment with a close friend, was overheard saying, "They planned this from the start." A chilling belief was taking root that her royal chapter was never meant to last. The paranoia didn't surface overnight. It grew, slowly and relentlessly, fed by inconsistencies, cold silences, and carefully timed setbacks. Meghan had once dismissed the idea that the palace monitored her life beyond the headlines. But now, with the reversal of their property rights executed with uncanny precision, she could no longer ignore the signs. Patterns emerged, conversations mysteriously misquoted in the press, decisions leaked before even her closest aides were informed, private meetings somehow making their way into public speculation. It all began to feel less like coincidence and more like choreography. A long game had been played, and she was only now realizing she'd never been a participant, only a target. Trusted confidants began to share the warnings they once withheld out of politeness or fear. One admitted she'd been told early on by a former royal liaison that Meghan and Harry's property rights had been deliberately structured to allow quiet reversal. "It's conditional," the warning had said. "A gift, not a guarantee." Meghan had pushed back then, believing that love, family and title would offer protection. But hindsight cut like a blade. Everything from the ambiguous wording of their residency clause to the subtle power Charles's legal advisors had retained had been designed with one purpose: control. Her belief in stability had masked the reality of a system engineered to bend only in one direction, back to the crown. The Eagle team confirmed her worst fears. Buried within the Sussex agreements were escape valves, clauses disguised as formality but written with precision to reclaim the estate should any public or institutional misalignment occur. The language was vague enough to bend and sharp enough to cut. Meghan, upon hearing this from her lawyers, was reportedly inconsolable. Her anger was not just at the betrayal, it was at herself. She had signed the papers in good faith, thinking her marriage granted her security, not a trap. Sources describe her as fierce and distraught, spending hours rereading the fine print, scouring every line for some thread of miscalculation she could unravel. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation was that this plan had been in quiet motion since early 2024. A secret strategy formed by Charles's inner legal circle, a council that had carefully avoided detection while gathering the authority needed to act decisively. Their method wasn't confrontation, it was patience, delay, silence, waiting until the Sussexes were far enough removed, distracted, emotionally drained, and when they struck, it wasn't just lawful, it was irreversible. Even more disturbing were murmurs that Prince William, often seen as a bridge between factions, had been deliberately left uninformed. Whether by design or deception, his absence from the decision-making process was conspicuous. It raised questions about isolation not just for Meghan but for the heir himself. While Meghan questioned loyalty within and beyond the family, the palace was preparing its next move, one that would shatter diplomatic boundaries. From Montecito to Manhattan, the shockwave was immediate. Meghan's inner circle erupted, Hollywood allies stunned, philanthropic partners blindsided. The crown had drawn its line in stone, and the fallout reached far beyond British borders, inside Meghan's California residence. A storm was brewing. What began as a quiet brunch turned into a high-stakes crisis meeting. Phones buzzed non-stop. Advisors scrambled to assess the global response while close friends argued over the next step. Should Meghan speak now, strike with clarity and power, or retreat into silence and let the fury build naturally? Opinions clashed. Some demanded she make a public stand, expose the betrayal, and call out the monarchy's quiet warfare. Others cautioned her to pause, suggesting a delayed strike might reveal deeper cracks inside the institution. But amid the strategy talk, Meghan said little. Those close to her described her demeanor not as weak, but as stunned, overwhelmed by the sheer velocity with which the rug had been pulled out from beneath her. The emotional toll was impossible to ignore. Years of calculated resilience were now meeting a moment of pure fatigue. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried none of the polish the world expected. It was raw, it was real. She confided to a friend, "I feel like I've lost the only home that ever felt like mine." That vulnerability, however, became a beacon. It didn't take long for the US media engine to roar to life. Major networks reached out offering exclusive interviews, streaming platforms hinted at feature-length opportunities, and producers whispered of documentaries waiting to be greenlit. But behind every offer was a price. The question wasn't if Meghan could speak, it was whether she could do so without losing more than she already had. At the same time, another wave of suspicion surfaced. Quiet rumors hinted that Netflix might have had early whispers of the Crown's decision. Timing, after all, was everything. An internal Sussex representative reportedly questioned why a producer had recently asked about Frogmore's future in a casual meeting. Was it coincidence or a leak? Trust, already frayed, now teetered dangerously close to collapse. Every relationship, every alliance was under renewed scrutiny. In the world Meghan had tried to build outside the palace, loyalty suddenly became a currency far more precious than fame. Then came the discussion that chilled everyone in the room: relocation. Temporary, perhaps, necessary, maybe, but the idea that Meghan, who had fought to build a life of freedom and voice, was now considering vanishing from the public eye, even briefly, struck at the core of everything she had stood for. A change of country, a pause from media, an escape from the relentless tension was floated by her most protective aides, and for the first time in years, Meghan didn't outright refuse. That silence alone spoke volumes. But as Meghan regrouped across the Atlantic, another royal figure quietly entered the fray, and her presence would change everything. She said nothing, but her silence was deafening. Catherine, Princess of Wales, made no statement. Yet her recent appearance near the repurposed Sussex properties left the world wondering, was she the Crown's chosen symbol for this power transfer? What began as a quiet walk on palace grounds erupted into a storm of speculation. Catherine, seen near the now vacated Frogmore estate alongside a senior royal aide, appeared calm, poised, and almost ceremonial. It wasn't the visit itself that raised questions, it was the timing. Days after the announcement that stripped Meghan and Harry of their royal property rights, Catherine's presence sent a message without uttering a word. Her appearance wasn't casual, and those watching closely knew it. The walk wasn't just a stroll, it was a symbol. And it was impossible to ignore the deliberate styling, a wardrobe choice steeped in royal tradition, echoing eras of queens past. The kind of look that didn't whisper royalty, it declared it. Kensington Palace refused to see or meant. No confirmations, no denials, no clarifications. The silence only added fuel to the growing blaze. In media circles, the move was interpreted as intentional positioning. A subtle yet sharp contrast was being drawn, one between the woman removed from the estate and the woman who might now be linked to its future. For Meghan, the impact was personal and immediate. According to sources close to her, the optics were devastating. She reportedly confided, "They're replacing me without saying a word." It wasn't just the loss of property that stung. It was the quiet unveiling of a new narrative, one that suggested continuity through someone else's grace, not hers. Behind the scenes, that interpretation wasn't just speculative. Internal palace memos, leaked discreetly to a senior royal watcher, suggested that Catherine had been briefed on plans related to Frogmore's potential ceremonial use. Events, charity visits, even future royal residencies ideas floated, none confirmed, all significant. Meghan's name was absent in every scenario. The entire tone of the documents, according to the leak, was clinical and deliberate. There was no discussion of legacy or past occupants, only forward-looking agendas. In a single stroke, the past was being erased not through aggression but omission. Public opinion quickly fractured. Some admired Catherine's dignified silence, calling it regal restraint. Others saw calculated dominance. Social media lit up with comparisons, debates, and competing headlines. One side applauded her grace, the other called it a quiet coup. But what became clear was that the monarchy was crafting a narrative that didn't require confrontation. They were telling the world who mattered simply by who remained. And in this quiet battle of presence versus absence, Catherine was winning without even entering the arena. As the public dissected Catherine's silence, not a voice long absent from royal circles was preparing to break their silence. When Harry finally spoke, it wasn't a speech, it was a reckoning. Behind palace walls and press silence, he had been spiraling. Now, torn between duty and defiance, he was forced to choose his wife's heartbreak or the crown's iron fist. For days he had remained restrained, absorbing the blows silently, watching as the home they once believed sacred was stripped away without warning. But silence, for Harry, had a limit. According to insiders, that limit was shattered in a flurry of calls, furious, desperate, and unfiltered. Multiple aides reported receiving direct and emotionally charged messages from the Duke, laced not with threats, but disbelief and raw anger. One aide allegedly described it as the most unhinged royal communication they had witnessed since the Diana era. There were no legal niceties, no polite inquiries, only one message pulsing beneath every word: "How dare you?" At the core of Harry's fury was more than property, it was identity. Torn between the blood that tied him to the institution and the vows he made to his wife, the emotional fracture ran deeper than any public could grasp. Friends close to the Duke described a man battling ghosts, his loyalty to the legacy of his mother, his guilt over abandoning the royal machine, and now the torment of watching his wife suffer because of his past. Meghan's pain wasn't abstract. He saw it in every tear, every sleepless night, every time she walked past the nursery once designed for their son in Frogmore Cottage. And in the shadow of that anguish, Harry found himself asking if leaving was ever truly possible, or if the crown would haunt them no matter how far they ran. That internal storm reached its apex during a reportedly explosive exchange with a senior royal advisor, one who had been directly involved in reviewing inheritance losses linked to royal property and titles. The confrontation was said to be sharp, personal, and unrehearsed. Harry, driven by both rage and confusion, demanded answers on why certain clauses were activated without consultation, especially those affecting property access for his children. The reply, allegedly cold and technical, only fanned the flames. According to a palace source, Harry left the conversation shaken, but not broken, determined to strike back. And then came the leak. Private journal entries, never intended for public eyes, surfaced through anonymous channels. In one, Harry wrote, "This isn't just property, it's proof that forgiveness was never real." The words were heavy. They exposed a man still clawing at the possibility of peace, only to be met with rejection dressed as tradition. And in those lines, another truth emerged. This battle wasn't just about today, it was about his children's tomorrow. With the properties now reclaimed and their status unclear, Archie and Lilibet's future within the royal structure hung in a precarious balance. Would they be welcome at events? Would their heritage be reduced to whispers and footnotes? While Meghan reportedly urged caution, afraid of the toll this war might take on their remaining sanity, Harry began pursuing legal consultations. Retaliation wasn't his first instinct, but it was quickly becoming his only weapon. His trust in negotiation was evaporating, and with each passing hour, the lines between reconciliation and rebellion blurred. With tensions flaring and loyalties splitting, Buckingham Palace was about to deliver its most calculated and devastating announcement yet. The scroll was delivered, the ink was dry, and the monarchy had spoken. In a televised briefing with all the trappings of tradition, the Crown formally announced the return of all Sussex properties into direct royal stewardship. Meghan Markle, not mentioned once. It was a moment choreographed down to the second. The Crown's press secretary emerged with a document sealed in royal insignia, the wording rehearsed, the tone deliberate. The world watched as centuries of tradition met a modern reckoning, and the verdict was cold. There were no flourishes, no emotion, no attempt to soften the blow. The statement cited structural realignments in Crown property management, a phrase so calculated in its detachment that even seasoned royal analysts flinched. There was no use of names, no personal references, only roles and policies. Meghan, a woman who had once walked palace halls and carried the hopes of a modern monarchy, was invisible in the very announcement that dismantled her place in royal history. What stunned observers wasn't just the decision, it was the precision of the omission. Not a single mention of the Sussex titles, not a word about past contributions or personal investment in the properties now revoked. It was as if the chapter had been erased entirely, redacted from institutional memory. Meghan's legal team, according to insiders, had received no advance notice. The press briefing blindsided them. Huddled in a California office with advisors, her lawyers scrambled to respond, not just to the property loss, but to the method of its delivery. One source close to the team admitted, "We were expecting quiet bureaucracy. What we got was a public execution by silence." And while Meghan watched from across the ocean, another layer of the spectacle deepened the wound. Catherine and William were both present at the televised address, not as speakers, but as visual pillars of continuity. Their presence was interpreted by many as symbolic, a regal backdrop to the monarchy's resolve. Some called it unity, others called it intimidation. But for Meghan, there was only one word that echoed louder than the rest: replacement. The couple who once welcomed her into the fold now stood, wordless, as the doors slammed shut behind her. The reaction was instant and ferocious. Media outlets worldwide split down ideological lines. British tabloids hailed the decision as a restoration of order. American commentators called it a calculated act of cruelty. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended within minutes. Supporters of Meghan expressed outrage over the erasure, the coldness, the precision. Others defended the Crown's right to reclaim what it once gave. But beneath all the noise was a quiet, growing realization that the monarchy hadn't just reclaimed property. It had redrawn the map of inclusion. It had sent a signal that loyalty to the institution wasn't enough. Presence, power, and silence had spoken louder. But even as the dust settled, a final twist was quietly unfolding, one that would make Meghan question everything she thought she had left. Buried deep within the property contracts, one clause had been forgotten, or perhaps ignored. Meghan's legal counsel uncovered a detail that could change the game, but only if she dared challenge the monarchy in open legal combat. It was during a late-night legal review, led by an American constitutional specialist with a background in international inheritance law, that the clause surfaced. Hidden among innocuous language and old estate frameworks was a line tied not to Meghan or Harry, but to Archie. The clause. E suggested that in the event of royal-born children residing outside the UK, but retaining their succession rights, certain properties could not be permanently reassigned without a formal disclaimer from the legal guardian. It was a technicality, a forgotten relic, but in this new context, it became a ticking bomb. The Sussex legal team froze. The clause didn't reverse the Crown's decree, not yet, but it introduced ambiguity, a gap in the armour. And for Meghan, it forced a question she hadn't wanted to face. Should she fight? The debate behind closed doors was fierce. One camp argued the clause provided grounds to issue a temporary injunction, halting any final transfer until clarity on Archie's standing was achieved. Another group insisted it could spark a full legal review of the monarchy's right to reclaim the properties unilaterally. But the risks were monumental. To invoke that clause meant war one fought not in whispers, but in global courtrooms, under the full glare of international media. It meant Meghan would have to shift from victim to litigant. And while many believed the law might lean in her favour, Others warned that public sympathy could fracture if she was seen to drag a child into a constitutional standoff. Sources close to her described Meghan as deeply conflicted. "Do I want this war?" she reportedly asked. Not in anger, in exhaustion. She had already faced exile, erasure, betrayal. This clause felt like the last match left in her hand, but lighting it meant setting fire to a structure that could never be rebuilt. Advisors urged caution. The Crown's global reputation still carried weight, and the backlash could be swift. Headlines in the UK were already framing the clause's opportunism. Legal analysts warned of political entanglements, with Parliament possibly pulled into the fray. Diplomats, quietly watching, braced for constitutional blowback. To Buckingham Palace, the leak of the clause sent tremors. King Charles, according to a senior source, was visibly shaken, and reportedly furious that the existence of the clause had not been neutralized earlier. A meeting with top legal officials followed within hours. Behind the gilded doors, panic met pride. They had acted with certainty, and now a single line in a forgotten document threatened to destabilize everything. Yet, amidst the royal fury, Meghan's team moved with methodical precision. They began drafting a counter-proposal not for publicity, but for leverage. A private offer that might allow the Sussexes a symbolic foothold without triggering total war. The goal was simple: gain ground quietly while still preserving the ability to go public if betrayed again. As the legal clock ticks and the world watches, all eyes turn to Meghan. But the final blow wouldn't come from lawyers, it would come from a letter. A sealed letter, dated years ago, resurfaced at the very heart of the property war. Addressed to Meghan, written by none other than Queen Elizabeth herself. Its contents? A heartbreaking mixture of hope, legacy, and one last wish that neither the Crown nor Meghan could ignore. The letter came quietly, passed through unofficial channels by an unnamed royal aide no longer in active service. No headlines, no announcements, just a simple envelope bearing the late Queen's unmistakable signature, tucked into Meghan's private mail. For a moment, everything stopped. The legal battles, the media frenzy, the emotional chaos. It all fell silent as Meghan sat alone with the words of a woman who, despite the palace machinery, had once offered her something close to acceptance. The contents weren't legal, nor directive. They were personal. The Queen had written it during a period of increasing turmoil in the family, a time when whispers of departure had only just begun. And yet, she had seen it coming. "Guard what is yours," the Queen had written in her signature cursive, "but walk with grace. Not everything worth having will be defended by others. Some things only you can protect." There was no bitterness in her tone, no veiled warnings, just sorrow and understanding. She acknowledged Meghan's pain, her difference, and even her struggle for space in a house that hadn't made room for change. The words struck deep. Meghan reportedly broke down upon reading it, unable to reconcile the warmth of the Queen's final message with the coldness of the Crown's actions in the present day. The woman whose blessing had meant so much was gone, but her voice lingered, and with it, a decision. The tone within Meghan's camp shifted. No longer driven by retaliation or fear, she chose something unexpected: resolution. In a public statement, measured yet moving, she addressed the property decision with dignity. There was no accusation, no bitterness, just clarity. She spoke of history, of transition, and of honoring the lives that would benefit from what came next. The announcement stunned many. Frogmore would not be contested. Instead, it would be converted into a charity foundation, overseen by a new board that included representatives from both Sussex and Crown teams. Its mission to support displaced families, promote mental health resources, and serve as a living tribute to reconciliation was unlike anything the palace had expected. Behind closed doors, another shift occurred. Rumours emerged of a discreet meeting between Catherine and Meghan, facilitated not by publicists or courtiers, but by mutual contacts who had grown tired of the quiet war. Though no formal details were released, insiders claimed the two women agreed on limited terms that would ensure their paths did not remain at odds, at least publicly. It wasn't friendship, but it was peace. For the first time since the fracture began, there was mutual recognition of pain and of the need to break the cycle of silence. In the end, it wasn't about land, titles, or walls. It was about legacy, wounds, and the quiet power of dignity in a palace that still echoes with both division and memory. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.